going to start talking a little bit about how some of these thoughts and trends could come home and what are some of the challenges that are so unusual here. Because while you have, and we're going to talk a lot about the fact that sustainability and walking and getting out of your cars, and when I say you, it's you in general, but trying to figure out how to accomplish that is not so obvious as it would seem. And some of the challenges that you've had we think we can begin to explain. So let's take a look at Mission Beach and parking. Should be there more of it or less of it? And so we started to ask questions. Is the beach too full? No, there's plenty of room on the beach. Is the parking full? Well, yeah, not really. There's usually little room someplace with turnover. Well, are the streets at capacity? Well, yes and no. What's going on over in Mission Beach is that if you take a look at it, people who are driving up to the beach on peak days, we hear, will put up with a delay of about 30 minutes. And then they go someplace else because they can go other places. So when you take a look at it, yeah, the streets are busy, but what's really going on is what's monitoring the amount of people who can get to that beach is really how crowded and how long that delay is. So could you solve this with transit? Why don't you try running a shuttle every once in a while? Well, it didn't work, right? Not really. It's not there, and it won't work. We don't think it's going to work. And why is that? Because people, remember, they don't need and want to put up with the delay. If that bus is in the same single line of traffic as all the cars are, it takes you even longer because you had to get out of your car or bicycle, get on the bus, and you don't need to do that. So there's no advantage to transit unless you can get rid of the cars. Well, why don't we add some parking? That'll solve it. Well, here's what happens. You add parking. Let's say you add 200 spaces. If anybody can find 200 more spaces on Mission Beach, well, then the rest of the people coming, because there's lots of people who want to come, will put up with it until they get about a 30-minute delay. It'll go right back to where it was, but you will have a couple hundred more people on the beach. So parking really doesn't solve it either. What if you go to buses only? Now, this is something you actually could do, and some communities have done this. It's a visitor. It's a Saturday in the summer. You really can't drive unless you live there or you're staying in a hotel. You have to take a bus. Would that work? It can definitely work, but you have to have the buses really, really frequent. So if you go to Martha's Vineyard in the summertime, you cannot drive down to the ferry terminal. You've got to park 5 or 6 miles away, and there is a bus every 5 minutes. Don't even think about it. It's faster. It's so much faster to be on the bus. But whether you could actually achieve that or not is another question politically. So really, if you want to have more people, in Mission Beach, it's squeezing more bicycles and pedestrians and rollerbladers onto that beach. You've got one way on, one way out, and unless you widen it, unless you radically change it, it's not a transit place. It's very unusual to have a place like that, but that's what's been going on. So one of the things that we can talk about, though, is having a better environment for the places, the people who are there, not cramming more people on, not rearranging the parking, but having a better experience. Now, I'm going to talk about PB, and I have to say that until I came here, I thought PB was peanut butter. And I'm never going to hear about a PB&J again without thinking of my visit with you all. But as we talk about PB, one of the things that's interesting is that the relationship to the water is what's been driving so many people to come here for ever since this place was created. In the streets, most of your street grid, actually the long blocks, are oriented towards the water. Down by the point, it actually turns because that's where the water was. Makes a lot of sense because that's where the value is. If I was a real estate developer, I'd do it that way. Now, what's interesting then, you got to get up and to and from those blocks. So there's another fabric of streets that turn the other way. And then you've got the major feeder roads, whether that's Ingraham or Grand or Garnett. So one of the things you can do and what you have done is to make those streets kind of equivalent. Again, remember, we're going to be talking about let's get out of the cars, let's have a better quality of life in pedestrian-oriented place. But the way you've treated your streets, north, south, east, and west, is almost the same, the business of the stop sign and the widths being the same. You could think of it differently. You could say, let's make sure that we can get to and from north-south, keep those roads clear, and put the stop signs the other direction. But the other way you could think about this is a place where you want to get to and from the water, and you could give priority to the green routes, the ways to get to the water, and the pedestrian connections that are there. So now we're going to talk a little bit about how, when we think about the trends and opportunities, you might think about the future. So here was Pacific Beach, aerial view, 1914, 100 years ago. And here is, from the same vantage point, what it looks like today. Just to get that again, it's such a good effect, right? That's 100 years, but let's take 50 years. 1946, just over 50 years ago, same view. So as you look into the future, one of the things I think that you have an opportunity is to think long-term and not just short-term. This place has changed fantastically every 50 years, and as we think in the future, it could and maybe it will change, but you're in a position to manage that change. As we take a look at the district, one of the things that's interesting about any community is the layering of uses. You have uses along the waterfront that are advantaged by those, the commercial areas that have stretched all the way back, and the shift in gears and the agglomeration of uses up by the highway. And there's a kind of layering, and you know that that's the case. One of the things that has been interesting is that right in the middle of that map, there's been increasing housing over time that has been taking what was the single-family bungalow world and turning it into multifamily. In that trend, that center point and how it relates to the commercial areas that Ed's been talking about is something that, as urban designers, we think a lot about. So as planners, we think a lot about walking and how far people actually will walk reasonably. It's about half a mile if you want to go to a restaurant, half a mile to go to an amenity like a beach, half a mile to walk to transit rather than taking your car. So let's take that half a mile dimension and look at your community. The one line on the left, that's half a mile from the beach. Okay, so a lot of this is away from the beach, but if you take half a mile from Grand and Garnett, that's almost the entire community. And if you add up where the transit's going to be and put a half mile there, you are an immensely walkable community. It's almost exactly the same size. So how do we get that to be accomplished? One of the things that we need to think about is this notion of where housing occurs and how it relates to those places. You've been changing from the bungalow world that was once here when the real estate developers of 1914 and 1946 were thinking about the future. I don't think they envisioned quite the density of multifamily houses. And if we take a look at the way your blocks are organized in one of the more residential areas, by that I mean single-family areas, you do have a mix of buildings that are quite close to one another that built up over time. And one of the questions that you have to answer is how you want to work with zoning and the design standards that or methods that you could use about the future. One thing that you could think about is a pattern that you already have, which are almost double units, where there are units well-shaped, but back in the backyards. The backyards have been available, and with units along the alleyways, you can end up with a scale and character that is actually quite pleasant. But another way to do it is to say that maybe what we need to do is to have really responsible, careful design multifamily buildings that have courts and open spaces that the community can enjoy as they walk by, and bring some of that landscaping and open space. So we think you have some important choices as things change and grow. But along the commercial areas, as Ed has pointed out, the amount of commercial use is actually not so strong, and you really do have some interesting choices. If we take a look at the character and the quality and just the value of some of the buildings, it's not unimaginable, and that's just the mass of the buildings today modeled over the top of that aerial photograph. The idea of having housing which has some retail, commercial, a coffee shop, a convenience store in areas where it makes sense, but creating a better rhythm and pattern and scale along the street are choices that we think you have and you're going to need to be thinking about in the next few years. But let's take a look up at the transit station and this area, gateway of to the community. Now, I know that many people will be thinking of the Claremont station as the most convenient transit station. This is in a very crowded place in terms of traffic. But if you take a look at it and start thinking about it, there's where the new rail station is planned to be. And one of the challenges, if we're going to increase access, is how the heck do you get there? And one of the choices that other communities have made when you have an underpass circumstance in busy roads is actually to structure an overpass. And if you start thinking about an overpass and where that could occur and what that would look like as you approach, we're headed down towards San Diego from the north. An elegant span across the roadway can be a really interesting beacon and a symbol of practically how people can get to and from the rail station. But one of the things that can happen, and we think you should think a lot about, is how transit-oriented development could occur. So if we take a look at the land that is next to the highway, that land has really been the back door of the community. That's storage, the storage units are back in there, and parking storage for the car dealers that they bring forward. But a transit station really can change that. And if you remember what Ed said, this is extremely important. Most of the people who have jobs here are going away and clogging up those streets, and because there aren't good jobs here. So many of the people who are coming into the community aren't living here. If you could have high-quality jobs that people would come to the community and leave and would provide jobs here, you'll have a far more sustainable future. So we started noodling, looking at some sketches. This is on the right-hand side where the train station would be, and we began to realize that some of that land is what we call soft. It could really change over time, right in the right location. And if you can imagine taking advantage of the grades there, building up some platforms where there's some parking below and buildings up on top, linked to a bridge and peering over their neighbors down towards Mission Bay, you start to think, holy smokes, this could be a great address. This could be a better place to go to work rather than commuting a long way away. And people could actually come to PB and not just take the transit away from PB. So we put all of this together and thought a little bit about what the daily experience of a person who lived here might have in the future with some of the improvements that we're going to talk about. So we're going to have a person, and we're going to end up at their house on Missouri. But we've got to come up. We're going to come up from the downtown. We're going to arrive, and here we are on what you can only think of as a wide boulevard. And one of the things that we want to point out is that the width of your lanes and the widths of the lanes on the outside are very, very wide. And you need to have better places for people to walk and for people to ride bicycles. And you're going to need to think about how you allow flexible use of sidewalks, shared paths, and roadways to encourage bicycles. And just expanding that zone without, by the way, these lane widths you still have are very significant. And around the country, people are learning the term road diet. If you just take a little bit of a diet here, there's a lot more room for pedestrians and bicyclists. In fact, it seems really strange that you've got on-street parking up near where you've got these huge parking lots with of car dealerships. Just think about the scale and the character that could occur if lighting was pedestrian scaled. Those great lights you have down on the beach and street trees that were sustainable and actually giving shade along those edges. The room's here. Now you come to, this is a quite famous intersection, right? 70,000 people a day. We've heard about it. And we were saying, well, nobody can possibly walk across. Well, there's a guy. Look at him. There he is. And he's stranded, right, on that island. But you really could. It doesn't take that much to really have some pedestrian markings that emphasize where people are going to walk. You can protect that guy a little bit with a little bit of a widened island in a place. And if you look at it, you stand here very long, you realize here's somebody, talk about a dangerous thing. There's being on a cell phone and driving, but there's being on a cell phone and crossing that intersection. That's really something. But you start to look around, and if you look back in the background, here's a group of people getting ready, guy in a wheelchair being pushed by his friends, and they're waiting their turn. There are pedestrians here. You do need to take care of them, and you can take care of them. Just widening the sidewalks and instead of blocking them. There are some narrow places, no doubt about it. As you were looking at the bridge across the Rose Creek, we couldn't get over the fact that you had to turn the sign sideways because otherwise you'd hit the bicyclists as they're going by. So it's bicycle friendly, sort of, but not in a normal sort of way. And but as we climb up past the naval housing areas and look at the sidewalks, even little marginal changes can make a big difference. But as we come up to some of this you really do have some incredible intersections. We're going to talk about, Paul's going to talk about roundabouts and what the potential benefits are. But from a green standpoint, from a community standpoint, from the sequence of coming home, just look at the difference. And that's pretty accurately drawn by one of our student interns who did a marvelous job imagining what the future would be with lighting. And there are no street lights. They're all gone, right? You don't need these street lights. As we take a look at other areas moving ahead, again and again, little bump outs, creating landscaping, marking it. What a difference to drive home in this kind of an environment where the sidewalk is extended. Now, when you come down into the business district, there's very little to critique and criticize. This is really a model that many people use. I think this guy up on top's a little on the threatening side. But other than that, it's a pretty nice environment from every standpoint. But as we turn up, so we're going to turn up Faneuil. We're almost home. And in fact, well, look what would happen if on your north-south blocks, you just added some crosswalks and some pedestrian areas. I mean, you can actually see that, right? Nothing there now. And this is one block from the school, the middle school. So we're home. We have no idea if this is somebody's home. We don't mean to be. And we just picked a house that we thought was a nice house. And of course, they could park on the front, in front of their house and walk in the front door. There they are. But you know, one of the things you have a great wealth of are parking garages back in behind your houses, and thinking about how you use that as a resource and the availability within the densities you have mean that in fact the on-street parking, except where you have these huge visitor loads, is really quite adequate. One of the things you can do, and this is boy, this is a strange sound system, but one thing you can do is actually add and push out the street quite a bit. And what many communities are doing is are using these as bioswales, as really interesting environmental opportunities. There's so much pavement here that you could do this without losing parking spaces. It would be much more green, much more interesting. And by the way, that's leading to the waterfront because we've gotten home. Now it's time to walk. We're about a mile away. But as we walk down, oh my God, you know, I'm going to the high value beach. You're common. All you need to do is put some crosswalks here, bump out a little bit, widen the streets, and just think about the difference and experience what the clues are and what the value is. It's interesting that when you come down to the high value condominiums right at the waterfront, they figured this out a long time ago. Right? If you did this, the values of so many of the homes would be so much better, so much nicer. But when you get to the end, here you are, and you can't get to the end. You got to climb over the railing with the way that the buildings were done. And there are these little places you could rearrange the parking, create a little bit of green space. But we do think that instead of these kinds of signs, when you come to the end, you should have these kinds of signs.